So let's talk through each army in Warhammer 40K and what are seen as their competitive must-haves in-game right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about strong Warhammer 40k units in general, going through each army in the game, and looking at the units that tend to appear in just about every top army for people who are trying to make optimised lists for that faction. In the past a couple of times before, I've tried to make videos that go through each faction in the game and talk through some of their strongest units, though for this one I thought I'd shake up the formula a bit, maybe rather than looking at units that are just generally very good in game, instead focusing on things that seem to find their way into the majority of Warhammer 40k lists that do well for the faction in competitive events. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to try and define an auto-include as things that the vast majority of players see as necessary for running a top army for the faction, maybe approaching 75% inclusion in top armies. Though obviously there's always people who manage to do things a bit differently for each faction, and if you're playing armies at a more casual level, there's loads of stuff that can be strong without having to bow to every single meta choice. It is kind of interesting to see the difference between merely units that are very strong and tend to crop up in every army list. If an army is going to get to auto-include status just by raw strength alone, then it generally means that you wouldn't really consider other units for its role, and it often means that if a faction's got multiple big strong damage dealers, then none of them wind up being truly auto-include because you could build with one or the other. Otherwise, though, things can absolutely be auto-include if they fill the niche in the army that every army needs to. They often tend to be kind of cheap supporting things that might run around doing secondary objectives, or be nuisance screening units that you can get in your army for super cheap. If there's things that aren't many points and add lots of utility, then they tend to get played in every list, as they tend to be handy regardless of your primary strategy. Maybe things like Ork, Gretchen and Stormboys could be a good example. It's certainly possible that even kind of weakish units could also become auto-includes as well if they're literally the only choice. Say if your army desperately called for an infiltrator type unit, if your faction only has access to kind of mediocre ones, they still might be auto-includes. If you desperately need that amount of screening, maybe to allow yourself to use some scout moves or something. As ever in 10th edition, detachment choice can change things around a lot. Realistically, there'd be a different sort of auto-include list for each detachment, and I might try and give it a few nods to that as I go along, but mainly focus on just generically strong picks, or things for the best way to play an army right now, and what most good players are using at tournaments. In any case though, let's jump right into it and talk through each army in the game, and what people seem to consider staple units right now from a review of competitive army lists. Starting out with the Space Marines, and curiously enough, the Adeptus Astartes don't really seem to be very heavy on the things that you absolutely must take in every list, just due to having very different detachments that work in different ways, plus a pretty massive amount of datasheets to fill the majority of battlefield roles. And after a good few balance passes, Games Workshop have tended to nerf the top stuff over and again. And now for the majority of big damage dealer style units, quite a lot of things are viable, varying quite a bit depending on which detachment you go for. Regardless of detachment though, there's a couple of units that the majority of them seem to make good use of. Scouts for 65 points being 65-point little infiltrator units to deploy in the midfield, skirmish over midfield objectives, and have their fun redeployment rules to put them back into reserve to do secondaries and things later on. They're some of the cheapest Astartes units, so maybe not too surprising they get a good look there. And to do that while having so much utility and also having not awful damage and defense really is a big win for them. I feel like it's rare that it'd ever be considered a bad move to put a couple of units of scouts in it to take the midfield early. The other more universally common pick though are the infiltrators, maybe more commonly a single unit of those, often tasked with holding the home field objective with their deep strike denial to 12 inches, which can be pretty massive against anything that can drop close or threaten big charges from reserve. And depending on the foe, you can switch up their play. You could use them as a midfield objective deployer if they're not coming in with deep strikers or outflankers and things. Beyond those though, there's all sorts of units that you can very viably use for lots of different battlefield roles. Looking at some focal detachment, Tech Marines are absolutely auto-include in Ironstorm for good reason, given they buff the vehicles and bear all the fun enhancements. Though for the actual tanks and vehicle units, there's just so many things that you absolutely could use and can be really effective, but maybe any one datasheet isn't super auto-include if you've got access to others. Perhaps options like the Vindicator, Gladiator, Reaper, and maybe Repulsor Executioner all could be pretty interesting, though I don't feel any one of them is absolutely mandatory if you wanted to build around other things. For the Vanguard and Gladius, it might be more their enhancements that seem to be auto-include. Fire Discipline for a Lieutenant or Apothecary Biologist in the Gladius task force, likely leading Aggressors or Hellblasters, and the Infiltrate one in Vanguard, often with Aggressors again for that one. I've certainly seen it used on other things as well. Maybe the Land Raider Redeemer could be worth a good mention as well if you want to deliver some on-foot melee combos. I feel like that's certainly a massively strong Space Marine datasheet, but perhaps not quite auto-include given that it's quite a big investment, and if you're not building around a melee or close-range shooting thing, then you might choose other options. Before we go on, I thought I'd just mention the video sponsor, a new and upcoming wargaming store called The Wargamer, based in the UK in Leicester. It's always good to see some new wargaming stores start up, and they reached out to me to ask if I could give them a shout out to let everyone know that they're now a thing, aiming to break into the discount wargaming market with a big 20% off most Games Workshop products. That's usually as good as it gets here in the UK. The web store is really quite a refreshing and easy to navigate one. I think that a lot of people will be impressed versus some of the other offerings out there. And they offer the things that you'd expect, like being able to backorder stock from Games Workshop, so if you put an order with them and then it turns up in a bit when Games Workshop restocks them, and they do free track delivery for every order over £85. They only seem to have a really nice attitude and a good focus on customer service. And just taking a look over their latest offerings, at least at time of recording, they still have that Biosanctic Broodsurge box set on sale, which a lot of places in the UK are out of at this point. Not sure exactly how much stock they have left of that, but if you wanted that at 20% off, then this could be a place for it. In any case, I'll give them a link down in the video description, and a big thank you for sponsoring this video. Moving on though, let's talk through some more armies, and we'll go through the Divergent Space Marine chapters next. For the Blood Angels, it seems right to focus on their Sons of Sanguinius detachment, as that's by far the most competitively played for them at the moment, with a big +2 strength, +1 attack, and the devastating Red Rampage stratagem on the charge. On the HQ side of things, the Sanguinor is in the vast majority of competitive lists. He's got that really fun ability to just step into a melee from off the board. He's pretty nasty in combat, and gets fight first to hit before the enemy. In the right situation, he could certainly cut down enemy units before it cuts down you. Being a scary lone operative after that is no bad thing either. Otherwise, jump intercessors probably borderline make it their way into auto-includes for standard Space Marines, but they're far more than that in Blood Angels. They're cheap, deep-striking secondary scorers with good movement, which will be more important than ever going into the whole Pariah Nexus thing. But give them the Sons of Sanguinius and they go up to 11 with Strength 6 chainswords, and a very scary amount of attacks on the charge plus their mortal wounds. Lamartes and Death Company are still an absolute staple. A big investment unit after the points rise, but not enough to turn people off them. They're very fast, hit phenomenally hard with reroll hit rolls, Lamartes' buffs, and Power Fist and Inferno pistols, and get -1 damage from Lamartes' defensive boost. Finally, the Captain with Assault Intercessors I think is worth talking about as well. 5 Assault Intercessors and a Captain with a Power Fist feels like a really generic pick, but it does great here. Again, Strength 6 chainswords on the charge with far too many attacks, and then re-rolling wound rolls against things on objectives, never mind the Captain with their Power Fist, getting the same re-roll wound rolls and using that Red Rampage stratagem for free. For the Dark Angels, perhaps unfortunately their auto-include list is a lot shorter. As I talked about in the tier list for them the other day, Azrael really is just head and shoulders above everything else. He farms command points, which is probably worth a good 30 to 40 points just on its own, and that in theory leaves you with a ridiculously good value character, a 4+ invulnerable save for his squad, and a once per game Watcher in the Dark, sustained hits both at range and in melee, and fairly good close combat stats in himself. He adds loads to just about any unit, whether it's Assault Intercessors or Hellblasters or anything in between. The other one I'd probably mention for them would be the Landspeeder Darkshroud if you're playing Ironstorm. Stealth and cover is great for anything with a 2+ save. It's also pretty awesome with the Stormraven gunship, which can't normally get cover very well. The signature move there is to swoop it up the board and cover that in a dreadnought that jumps out of it and let rip with a whole bunch of nasty guns. Next up for the Wolves of Fenris, their Thunderwolf Cavalry have been ridiculously dominant in 10th edition since the Stormlance Task Force came out. 30 points is just immense for 4 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ invulnerable save, and then some fairly nice general purpose stats with +1 damage on the charge, the anti-tank punch coming from a bunch of characters with things like Thunderhammers or Power Fist attached. Stormlance makes them next level, giving them advance and charge, and good defensive stratagems like the -1 to hit and wound 1 at range. Then it's basically a bunch of other stuff to support them. Wolfguard Battle Leaders on Thunderwolves for lethal hits and their reactive move thing. Harold Deathwolf and Wolf Lords on Thunderwolves are pretty amazing for the free stratagems and the extra advance and charge boost. Logan Grimnar seems to be featuring in the majority of competitive lists these days, often on Storm Rider, and brings good personal melee, plus a massive turn of charge and melee hit rerolls. And then after that, probably Wolfen are the next closest. They're kind of oddballs in that they're just very cheap for their stats at like 80 points. They're fairly fast, not standout flimsy, but bring a whole load of melee punch with a bunch of AP1 damage 2 with their Wolfen hammers, far more than you'd really expect for 80 points, with the downside of not being able to take objectives. They're certainly less ubiquitous than the Thunderwolves in their support, though the majority of lists seem to take at least some. For Deathwatch, as ever, there's not really much data to work with. They're basically unplayed and competitive at the moment, thanks to Games Workshop not really giving them any help last time round. Where I have seen them running competitive lists, though, the Proteus kill team tends to be the thing that they build around. A massive great big unit, well over 300 points, and the value there is just to have an exceptionally dangerous big value unit. You can equip them for melee with heavy thunder hammers, or range with frag cannons and cyclone missile launchers. And it means that any characters that you put there will have immense value, and any upgrades from the detachment, it could do crazy things like infiltrate them in Vanguard, or even give them fire discipline in Gladius potentially. Finally, for the Divergent chapters, we've got the Black Templars. For their ones, I thought I'd focus on their non-Ironstorm list, given that that tends to be fairly similar vehicles, I guess a few of them bolting on their Black Templar multi-melters, but mostly kind of similar to generic Ironstorm. For more general Templars though, Helbrecht and Sword Brethren are still hard to beat. The vast majority of players choose to run him competitively, 270 points now given the points increases to both datasheets, but if you go for maximal damage combos with them with things like Righteous Crusaders and buying in Templar Vows for 1 CP, then you have a little unit there that's going to be able to threaten most things in the game even with just 5 models, and should certainly make mincemeat of any more normal size units that they can contact. Perhaps the biggest interaction is the +1 damage of the Sword Brethren helping out Helbrecht's sweep attacks. They could easily get there in a Land Raider Redeemer or a Templar Impulsor with a multi-melter. Otherwise, kind of interestingly, reviewing the other datasheets, perhaps the other most consistent Templar pick is actually the Emperor's Champion these days. People were a bit less enthused with him at the start of the edition, but given that most of the other stuff has gone up in one way or another, it's gradually been becoming more and more prevalent. Here's just 75 points for 6 attacks at Strength 8, AP 3 and Damage 3. Those attacks get precision and +1 to wound characters, and he could get the +1 damage from Sword Brethren that he's probably leading as well. He is just a pretty murderously fighty character for that cost. Most characters in that point sort of range don't get attacks that are AP 3, Damage 3. Beyond Space Marines, let's move on to other Imperium though, and first up we have the Astra Militarum. Again, perhaps like the Space Marines, I feel like they've got a relatively large roster with some relatively balanced options, most things at least having some strength for the right niche in the army, even if a few things do still stand out. As ever, Lord Solar Leontus rears his highborn head, perhaps unsurprisingly being taken in basically every list between 1 command point free per turn, 3 godly orders that can affect all sorts of cool stuff, and repositioning things at the start of the game, and broadcast those orders around the board, which not every list chooses to use that combo. Some of them like him just bunched up with some artillery and things, but it does mean that the command squad often goes hand in hand with him. For the other most common HQ staple, Ursula Creed paired with an infantry squad with a mortar in it is also a backfield holding deployment zone sort of combo that's hard to pass up. Ursula Creed can get you to use a free battle tactic stratagem for a unit nearby, so she can make 1 mortar hit equate to the Fields of Fire stratagem, and effectively hand out an AP-1 debuff against the thing that you're just about to light up with the rest of your gun line. Really quite efficient to be able to put that exactly where you need it on the board. Finally, for sort of buffing units that tend to be included regardless of list, I feel like Scout Sentinels, at least 1 or 2 of them, is never going to be a particularly bad choice. At the absolute worst, you've got a cheap and tough, annoying combat walker with a scout keyword, a las cannon and a hunter-killer missile. But the real value comes from its buff. Mark a unit within 18 inches for the rest of your army to reroll hit rolls of 1 against is pretty good on its own, never mind ignoring the indirect penalty for artillery. I'd say that they're perhaps the most staple auto-includes, though maybe other things that could be pretty near to that would be tank commanders, cheap units of Tempestus Scions for objectives, at least some artillery, though a bit more debate as to what, Bulgrins and Kazakin, and actually Attilan Rough Riders seem to be making a real comeback. Games Workshop putting their points down to 120 was a big deal for them. Next up, we've got the Golden Warriors of the Adeptus Custodes, still reeling from the rather brutal beating that was their codex. They're still not completely out of the running with something like a 45% win rate in games, so still remain at least somewhat playable casually. But they do have a codex that's limited in options in the first place, and at the moment it's kind of limited for good options even a bit beyond that, and it does mean that there's quite a lot of things that you just see in literally every list. Custodian Guard and Wardens both tend to crop up in most lists. Cheapish Golden Guardians with Guardian Spear attacks, it's hard to go too far wrong with. Custodian Guard for more damage on objectives and double shooting. The Wardens for the best tanks of the Codex with their -1 to wound and feel no pain. For characters leading them, Kyria Draxus and Custodian Guard is a rather auto-include little combo. Her shooting is just utterly immense, and given the Custodian Guard double shoot, rerolls, and even stratagems they can access, it means that she personally can account for entire squads worth of enemies. Preventing shooting at long range doesn't hurt either. The Blade Champion is probably the single most useful of the actual Custodes HQs, generally fighty and good for delivering Guard and Wardens at longer range. A few Prosecutors or Witch Seekers are going to be present in the vast majority of lists. Small cheap units for secondaries that you don't want to commit an entire unit of Custodians to, and certainly help out in Talons of the Emperor. And maybe moving into the territory of merely just very strong picks that are quite common, the Caladius and the Alaris Custodians are both worth a shout, I think. Not every list seems to use them quite as much as the above units, but they're still very strong in their own right, whether it's a murderous anti-armor tank or interesting teleporting Terminators to get around the board a bit faster than the on-foot Custodes. For the Sisters of Battle, they've just had a Codex release with a bunch of rules previewed, though we don't have points for that yet, so this is more based on previous units. Certainly pre-Codex, a staple unit was Morven Val and Paragon Warsuits, present in the vast majority of top-placing tournament lists. They are just hard to pass up as a big unit for their sheer damage output, maybe getting there with rapid ingress or making some judicious use of terrain up the board. Kind of ridiculously threatening with Val's rerolls and maybe the odd miracle dice or stratagem thrown in, and Morven Val could use that resurrect a character option to come back swinging one last time. Otherwise, at least some Battle Sisters tended to be a staple due to their miracle dice farming ability, often split in two with the Immolator. Now that's tied to the Simulacrum in the upcoming Codex. I don't know if we might see a bit of difference there. Still feel like they're going to be a strong unit to me though. For secondary objective duties, that often fell to Seraphim, cheap fast movers with deep strike that can move, shoot, move. They've got okay damage output with their hand flamers against hordes, and being able to move very quickly or just reach unusual sections of the board with deep strike and a movement. For some holy firepower, the Castigator really hasn't gone anywhere with its Ignor's cover battle cannon scything down the enemy elite infantry. Quite a lot of lists seem to take around about 2 of those on average. And Arco-Flagellants, despite moving all the way up to 160 points, don't seem to have stopped most people from playing Does It Blend with them. I guess they do lose their twin linked in the Codex, which is probably going to be a hit for them. But given that there are actually some Horde armies out there in the meta, they still might not be the worst choice in the world. Perhaps being just a little bit less ubiquitous, but still pretty good. Celestine and the Triumph of St. Catherine both appeared in lots of lists, though maybe not quite as many as these top ones. For the AdMech, Games Workshop's Forge Worlds are apparently designing some changes for them. We've yet to see exactly what's coming for them yet, but until that point it looks like for successful tournament lists, Horde mode Skitarii is still considered the order of the day. Chief amongst the units are the Skitarii Vanguard making up the battle line of the army. Nice objective control and debuffing that of enemies nearby. They often get around in Scorpius Dune Riders, have a fair few good options for enhancements in the unit with the Skitarii Marshal in the popular Hunter cohort, and if you are actually daring to add some mainline damage dealers to the army, then the Cataphon Breachers will certainly welcome their presence. The Rangers maybe are a little bit more debatable over them now they're finally the same points. Otherwise, one unit that sees loads of play are the Taraxi, fast, tough, and generally annoying. One of the talking points about the Skitarii Hunter cohort is that people often tend to use just massive units of Taraxi to just basically board block the enemy for several turns while the AdMech try and score. Not the way most people want to play Warhammer 40k, but sometimes a bit of dangerous innovation is needed when a codex is underpowered. The Skystalkers are nice with their movement shenanigans, and the Sterilizers have a whole bunch of anti-horde and can make some very good use of some of the stratagems of the Hunter cohort. Otherwise, Infiltrators are pretty common with having just at least one unit mid-board for a bit of screening, maybe backed up by some Cerberus perhaps, and either Dragoons or Iron Striders tend to crop up in more lists than they don't as well, just really efficient, tough, fast movers with a bit of solid threat, whether that's Las Cannons or Taser Lancers. They're not damage powerhouses, but a bunch of them could easily wipe out some mid-strength units. That's really not too bad going for quite how fast and how tough they are. Despite being much memed earlier in the edition, Cataphon Breachers don't really seem to be an auto-include for AdMech right now. They are arguably one of the best damage dealers, but it seems that the majority of lists that do well are passing them up to put more Skitarii Horde bodies on the table. For the Imperial Knights, they don't have a huge roster, and given the amount of choices, some things are just going to be necessary pretty much all the time. Armiger Warglaves, I don't think have ever really been a particularly standout bad unit since they came out. They're just kind of necessary as the frontline troops of the army. Nice efficient brawlers for 150 points that can put out some fairly frightening anti-tank shooting with their thermal spear and their inbuilt rerolls. They're fast with good OC and can sweep with those chain blades. Helverins equally see play though, a little bit cheaper for some spammed autocannon fire, getting the opportunity for anti-fly and a focus fire AP stratagem when they need it, and Canis Rex is easily the most played out of the big knights. Just compared with the rest of them, the raw damage that he gets just adds up to be flat better than basically any of the rest for the amount of points that he pays, and has a few other fun advantages like the free stratagem also, and Sir Hector getting out if he dies to be a nuisance unit. Finally, to round out the army, you likely want some sort of Imperial agents. A lot of lists just take a Calidus assassin to jump around the board, scoring secondary objectives. Quite an obvious counter to the weakness of knights not having units that cost less than 140 points otherwise. Maybe occasionally they might be supported by some small squads of Voidsmen or Inquisitorial henchmen, which could help out on the secondary game, or maybe even hold a primary in a pinch if the enemy's got no indirect or fast movers. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the Knights of Titan in the Grey Knights. Again, they've got a smaller roster than most, so several picks are basically in every list. Maybe the most notable and obvious, despite a weak start to the edition, are the Nemesis Dread Knights. They often see 3 of them in just about every single competitive army that does well, packing an Incinerator, Psy Cannon, and usually a Demon Great Hammer. Out of the choice of that and the Great Sword, which is still alright I think, they're basically what the Grey Knights need to take to deal with heavy units, and despite a points bump in the last update, getting the ignored cover and the extra AP on that heavy Psy Cannon really made them into an actual credible threat against taking out tough stuff. Otherwise, most lists take exactly one strike squad, used for their sticky objectives, which is just extra nice for an army that can go warping round the board. Really good to mark your home field with that and then try and move on to mark something in the midfield. The core of the army is almost always built around Terminators or Paladins, but some lists do like to throw in some other Strike Marine type variants like Purifiers. Most of the Grey Knight support characters work with the Terminators though, so they can be good for things like Librarians or Caldor Drago himself. Otherwise for characters, Librarians and perhaps the Grandmaster with the Nemesis Dread Knight are perhaps the ones that are looking like they're most commonly used right now, Caldor Drago being very popular as well. In general though, I feel like Grey Knights aren't in the worst position in the world, pretty much all of their roster at least usable, and just overall a pretty strong and easy to score with army in game. Moving on, let's get into the ranks of Chaos, and starting out with the standard issue Heretic Astartes, the vast majority of people seem to be running Renegade Raiders, so this list reflects that. If you're running Soulforged Warpack, then it's unsurprisingly going to be a whole bunch of Demon Engines, Warpsmiths, and maybe a couple of gun tanks to possess. For more general purpose Heretic Astartes though, Legionaries are where lots of lists seem to start. Super efficient and great OC, really quite strong threat with a bit of shooting and a bit of melee damage with those heavy melee weapons and the dark packs, and alright good durability per point. It just seems really hard to go far wrong with them, and they're massively efficient battle line choices, well capable of skirmishing with their peers that cost more points than them. To get them to the midfield, they'll often be set up in Chaos Rhinos and supported by a Chaos Lord. Free stratagems are nice for him, plus having just his massive damage boost once per game will help them take down things that they otherwise couldn't. The Lord and the Rhinos could take Chosen as well as an alternative. It seems that more people are choosing Legionaries on the whole, at least so far. Otherwise, looks like the majority of armies are taking one unit of Cultists, typically taken for sticky objectives. Likely mark it on the home field, stick around if you think that you need to actually protect it and screen it at all, or head towards the midfield potentially. Allied Nurglings are pretty excellent here, as they are with any army that can take them. They can infiltrate, deep strike and do secondaries, though admittedly it won't be too long until the Pariah Nexus missions kick in. And then perhaps we've got one of the biggest auto-includes out of all of them, the Warp Talons. Most army lists taking at least 10 of them, some army lists taking more. One enormous unit that can jump really quite far across the board with their jump packs, slice apart an enemy outlying unit with those talons, return to deep strike, and then pretty much immediately come back somewhere safe with rapid ingress, ready to do it all over again after the enemies had their turn. They're massively terrifying, provided you can stick to prey that they can handle in one round, or do enough firepower to soften up harder targets before they go in. Otherwise, there's quite a lot of gun tanks and demon engines that are pretty regularly taken, things like Venom Crawlers, Vindicators, Predators, and Forge Fiends, but maybe a lot more debate as to which exactly people like to run out of those. Maybe none of them feeling quite like they push to auto-include. Next up, for their Pestilent brothers, we have the Death Guard. An easy start to this list is Typhus himself. He's just been weirdly undercosted for a good while at the moment. 80 points for a fighty Lord of Contagion with a damage 3 Man Reaper and strength 9. An okay buff for his unit with the -1 to hit thing, but most importantly that massive mortal wound attack to just throw d6 mortal wounds at the enemy each turn. If he can live to trigger that twice, there's a reasonable chance he might have done enough damage to justify his existence, never mind anything else he does in melee. Otherwise, to take the midfield, the standard choice is Plague Marines and Rhinos, a genuinely threatening unit up close with their heavy plague weapons, and most commonly supported by the grenade shenanigans of the Biologist Putrefier, or perhaps the Foul Blightspawn with the Fights First and the Plague Sprayer. Death Shroud Terminators are the fighting elite of the army, and again it's a rare list that doesn't take a unit of them, just great damage and defense for the 40 points each. They could rapid ingress if they want to get around their slow movement if it makes sense, allied nerdlings once more, and then usually all backed up by some form of firepower and demon engines, something between plague burst crawlers, predator tanks, bloat drones, or allied war dog brigands. Most lists take a couple of selections from this list, but might mix it up with exactly what sort of hellish fire support they like. For the World Eaters, they have a notably tiny unique roster, and at the moment I'd say that pretty much all of their unique World Eaters units are fairly well balanced in competitive lists, so the majority of army lists that you look at take a copy of pretty much everything. For their truly unique models, maybe the two that are least consistently played might be the Lord on Juggernaut and Khan the Betrayer, though both of those I'd still consider very usable indeed. Every list tends to start with Angron, a huge meteorite of destructive rage, soaking up a bunch of fire as he hurtles towards the enemy, breaking anything he touches with enormous melee stats. He can threaten to turn one charge with his big movement and the blessings of Khorne, and has that all-important chance to come back, which can be game-winning if that happens. Otherwise, we've got Lord Invocatus to scout forward multiple things towards the midboard, maybe Khorne Berserkers or some Exalted 8-bound. The Master of Executions maybe being taken a bit more than Khan the Betrayer, having the Berserker Glaive to make him still a massive threat even despite the points increase, and basically just being there so the very cheap Berserkers have a bit more bite against really tough stuff. Berserkers in Rhinos often take at least one squad to skirmish on the midfield, maybe alongside a Master. They're particularly good for thinning out enemy hordes with mass damage 1 attacks, and Blood Surge can have them jump into combat, which can be really disruptive. Jackals get sticky objectives for nice and cheap, and some re-rolling on the blessings with their icons, often worth having a unit or two for that. And then 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound tend to be the fighting elite damage dealers after all the rest of the support things are said and done. 8-bound can scout forward naturally, and Exalted 8-bound needs Lord Invocatus or can deep strike. The 8-bound generally tend to excel against more enemy elite infantry and things, where the Exalted ones will be able to take down the heaviest stuff in the enemy army, but certainly pay a premium for their damage output. Overall, for a limited roster, I'd rate Games Workshop of having done pretty well with the World Eaters. A typical competitive list could run pretty much all of these fairly comfortably. Lastly, for the deity-specific legions, there's the Thousand Suns, who aren't really too far away from the World Eaters in a unique unit roster that's pretty tiny. And again, with those units so emphasised, they use the vast majority of it. Maybe not quite as ubiquitous as the World Eaters, though. Maybe things like Scarab Occult Terminators really still struggling to break through. Plus the Mutalith and Zangors, I'd say, are usable, but maybe not auto-include. For their roster, though, it always starts with Magnus, the linchpin of every army, with huge psychic damage and raw melee threat, massive speed, which can be doubled up with a Kabbalistic ritual, and he is often the one that's worth spending command points on for rerolls and focuses of rituals. He also buffs nearby psychic damage in a big way. Then most of the rest of the list tends to be made up of small units of Rubik Marines, occasional 10-man ones, with Warp Flamers backed up by Soul Reapers and Sorcerers. Maybe a squad or two could take a Rhino as a battlefield taxi to get them where they need to be. Those Warp Flamers with some damage buffs can really take down the vast majority of enemy targets with enough AP and automatic hits, particularly if you strip the enemy's armor saves away from them. Ahriman can boost them super nicely with +1 to wound and a free ritual, and then the majority of sorcerers see play in most lists, particularly the exalted ones on discs with the movement debuffs, Infernal Masters for damage, maybe with the damage enhancement that they can get, and the regular on-foot sorcerer for shielding from shooting. Then finally put all that together with at least some chaff units, cultists maybe being the most common go-to now that they drop down to 55 points. They're quite nice with their scout, invulnerable save, and their random occasional command point farming. Zangors, Enlightened, and Spawner are all usable in their own way though. Still perhaps a bit of a shame that the Scarab Occult Terminators are still looking at overshadowed compared with the rest. Very few competitive lists tend to use them, though the Thousand Sons are still generally having a good time, being one of the strongest armies in the game. For the Chaos Knights, it's a very simple discussion as usual. The Wardog Brigand and the Wardog Carnivore tend to make up a good 3/4 of most competitive Chaos Knight army lists, and have done for some time. The Wardog Brigand, with its fast-moving gun turrets that can hit enemies pretty hard whether they're monsters or lighter infantry. They can focus fire to good effect with a stratagem if they need to as well. And the Wardog Carnivore just brings fast-moving, bad personality, and heavy-hitting melee with the choice of 2 profiles, hitting on a 2+, and maybe using that walk-through-wall stratagem when they need to get where they need to be. Then usually if you're going for the standard competitive build for Chaos Knights, which is just full War Dogs, you need a Stalker to act as your Warlord with the character keyword. None of the bigger Knights, I'd say, would get anywhere near the status of auto-include. I've tended to see more people using Lancers than anything else, but that's still the minority and the exception to the rule. But allied demons make a big presence in most army lists, again usually Nurglings, which are extra nice in Knight lists when you don't have so many cheap units. Maybe a few Beasts of Nurgle as well, tending to be another common choice. Talking of the demons though, they've had a whole bunch of points revisions since the edition came out. At the moment there's maybe a bit less consensus as to exactly what units to take, though maybe perhaps the single most auto-includes might actually be the Great Unclean one at the moment, with the 4+ Feel No Pain enhancement that it can get. For 230 points plus the enhancement, the thing is just so tough that it's not really worth firing at most of the time, and can usually happily just stride towards the enemy with impunity, not with enormous damage, but enough to ruin a bunch of medium infantry if it contacts them, and add a good amount of bulk and nuisance to midfield objectives. Even if the enemy manages to kill it, then it's probably good news because they've just sacrificed so much firepower in doing so that they've probably left a good amount of the rest of your army untouched as a result. Otherwise, Nurglings, as per most Chaos armies, which we've talked about a lot already, infiltrate, deep strike and -1 to hit on a very cheap unit are all great things, and as mentioned, their time is numbered as an auto-include unit, given that their objective control 0 status means they won't be able to do secondary objectives and things in the new Pariah Nexus missions. Otherwise, beyond that, there's maybe a bit of a contingent of units that see more play than others, but genuinely quite a lot of variation between those units. Most lists take a good amount of other greater demons, maybe another 3 or 4 of them, though pretty much the entire menagerie of them are at least somewhat playable. Perhaps Be'lakor, Skarbrand, and the Keeper of Secrets seem to be a little bit more in fashion in recent times. Be'lakor perhaps being the biggest in-game decision for shielding your army from enemy line of sight and projecting his bubble of the Shadow of Chaos, though it does seem that not every single list chooses to take him versus fleshing out some of the others. The rest of the list do tend to have at least some genuine variation as well. Flamers, Fleshhounds, Blood Crushers, maybe Demonettes with the Mask, and Plague Bearers might often feature. At least a fairly good amount of somewhat usable stuff, even if there's a bunch of units in the Demon Codex that don't get played quite so much as these. Finally, let's get onto the ranks of the Xenos, and first up we have the Aeldari. Again, I'd probably rate them as an army that actually has fewer auto-includes than they used to have in the past, perhaps coming from being an army that have got a good roster of choices, and then I've seen multiple layers of nerfs, typically hitting all the stuff that was strongest in the faction and bringing a lot more things down to a level kind of pegging. So it's not that many things that actually make their way into the vast majority of Eldar army lists. Perhaps for some of the biggest standouts, the Autarch Wayleaper is a lone operative that rustles up command points, even despite his points cost going way up over the edition. He's still hard to go too far wrong with, get some extra CP earlier in the game while he's screening out the backfield with lone operative things, and then you've got quite a fast and at least a somewhat threatening character to go rushing around the board, maybe doing some secondaries later in the game. Otherwise, for really standout stuff, most armies take both Warp Spiders and Swooping Hawks, both extreme fast movers that aren't ridiculously high investment units and can deal a bit of good damage to the things that they're best at, either with their Torrent Death Spinners or their Las Blaster stacking a bunch of wounds. With their massive movement tricks, these two are exactly what you need to be able to essentially auto-complete certain secondaries. Having the Warp Spiders just be able to flat out teleport 24 inches is massive, so later in the game when you don't have to play as KG, you really can expend them just literally for victory points. Shadow Spectres maybe make up this trifecta a bit, though perhaps are a little bit less played both with model requirements and also due to having a points nerf, though they're still commonly taken. Beyond this though, there really does seem to be a lot of variation in how you can fill out an Aeldari list. If Rain's really popular, whether or not she's in Inari with a Storm of Whispers, Skyweavers can be cheap jet bikes to do more secondaries and interference stuff. Support weapons with D cannons are nasty. Falcon grav tanks and war walkers can put out some good threat. Dark Reapers do a bit of indirect. And things like Farseers, Rangers, and the Avatar of Cain and Guardians all have good things to offer. Overall, quite nice to see a whole bunch of things playable for the Aeldari. They definitely feel like they're in a position where they're more punching up a bit, as opposed to just ruining everything else in the game as they were early on. But their lists certainly feel a lot less cookie cutter than they used to be, besides maybe just a few fast moving units. Otherwise, for their Darkkin, they maybe don't have quite as much of a luxury of vast amounts of units to pick from, and with their Sky Splinter Force it really does incentivise you going down certain units as the core of the army, and maybe adding some things in as extras. I'd argue that almost literally every single datasheet in their index is at least somewhat interesting in its own way, some more than others, but these are the ones that perhaps tend to be the biggest staples. Razors and Venoms are absolutely central to the Sky Splinter. Basically all the rules revolve around transports there, so unsurprising that transports, which are already at the heart of the Drukhari strategy, are completely auto-include. Both of them are good, maybe the Raiders more if you want a big 10-man squad charging out of it, maybe 10 witches specifically actually. Otherwise, an Archon and Incubi can make things blend big time with their Lance keyword and a pain token invested. Otherwise, Lilith and Witches are also very similarly usable. A bit more of a lean into anti-horde mode things, but Lilith buffs and the pain tokens will make them pretty generally effective. At least some Cabalite warriors and transports are good to have for sticky objectives and a few more lance shots in firepower. Mandrakes seem auto-include for a bit of secondary objective action, doing infiltration to screen out when they need to, and fading round the board for secondaries, also having a bit of anti-infantry fire. Scourges jump shoot jump with a whole bunch of dart lances. Super frustrating for the opponents to be able to have anti-tank firepower keep on hitting them and there's just nothing they can do about them, particularly as not that many people are running indirect fire right now. Later in the game they can swoop out to do secondary and objective type things when their damage is done. And finally it's well worth having one singular Kronos at least for pain token farming. They're kind of obscenely tough for their cost and not really that bad to have more in my opinion, but at bare minimum one seems kind of auto-include to generate some more damage for the army, as well as just being an annoying nuisance when it needs to be. For the Tyranids, it'd be very rare to see an army list that doesn't take the Gargoyles, swooping around with their good OC and their move shoot move. Again, they're one of the units that can skirmish their way to unusual board locations to do secondary objectives, occasionally even snagging primary objectives out of deep strike if the opponent doesn't deploy their units squarely on them. Lots of options for them, and they certainly can do first turn move blocks as well if that's going to be useful. Otherwise, fairly ubiquitous in most armies is the Neuro Tyrant, buffing the Shadow of the Warp to actually make a lot more units actually fail that thing on the turn when you trigger it, and it gives you a good chance to deny the enemy some victory points or gaining a few of your own. That's worth a good few points just in itself for that ability, and beyond that he'll just be a fairly cheap torrent monster with an invulnerable save, often tasked to guard the home field objective, though he can push up a bit if it makes sense to. A bit of extra snaps doesn't really hurt as well. The Biovore is the Spore Mine scoring machine. You can throw OC0 Spore Mines around the board to do secondaries, and potentially stop the opponent advancing onto primaries turn 1, which occasionally can be big. His role, I guess, will change when Pariah Nexus missions kick in. Maybe that'll encourage them to improve the rest of Tyranids a little bit, hopefully. Exocrines, I think, do enough to be one of the truly efficient damage dealers of Tyranids, and they don't have all that many options, so it's not uncommon to see just about every army list throwing in 2 or 3 of them just to make up some volume fire. Lots of nice high AP plasma shots with damage 3 to make a big mark on medium infantry, and can certainly punch up against tougher stuff with lethal hits in invasion fleets. Maleceptors might be a little bit less common in literally every list, but do much the same thing but invulnerable saves and a different sort of debuff. Otherwise, near every list at least has some sort of lone operative, Tyranids having 3 good ones to choose from in Lictors, Neurolictors, and the Death Leaper. And there's plenty of other stuff I'd rank as common, though not 100% auto-include. Old One-Eye, Hive Tyrants for the 5+ Feel No Pain in Invasion Fleet, the odd Pyrovore for a bit of board screening, and a random Torrent attack, and perhaps as you'd expect flipping things on their head a bit for Unending Swarm, where it's pretty much Termagants with Spine Fists all the way. Next up for their cultist followers in the Genestealer Cult. Again, everything's really quite up in the air for them at the moment, given their codex and their points not out. So this one very much reflects Index Genestealer Cults and what they tended to run. The damage blocks of the Genestealer Cults tended to be fairly tried and tested. Neophytes with seismic cannons dropping in from Cult Ambush. lighting up the enemy with a whole bunch of general purpose strength 6 and damage D3 attacks, often buffed by stratagems, ridge runners, and the Primus for some big rerolls, maybe a Nexus for free stratagems if you felt generous. Otherwise, the ridge runner itself for the AP debuff was fairly auto-include, often with a mortar. Acolyte hybrids tended to be relied on to drop in and nuke the enemy with a whole bunch of demo charges, those ones using the 3-inch stratagem to get close. And the Reductor Saboteur was probably the most used out of the support characters, a lone operative that's just got so many types of explosive it's not even funny. Indirect ones, free grenades, reactive mortal wound ones, plus a demo charge all of her own. Seems like a lot of that's changing in the codex though. Big nerfs to the Neophytes and Acolytes in particular, though the Ridge Runner did pick up an AP debuff in melee as well that I managed to miss in the initial codex review. Could be a pretty massive shift in the way that Genestealer Cults are played, though I would guess that the Neophytes and Acolytes will need to go down in cost if they're going to remain strong given big ability reductions. For the Leagues of Votann, they've got a pretty small roster, so most things tend to get to be auto-includes when you don't have that many things to choose from. In a 2,000 point army, it does seem kind of guarantees that a bunch of things get taken. Within their roster though, I do feel like there's some things that are basically almost every list, and then a bunch of things that are more like maybe. On the must-take point of view, the Einhir Hearthguard tend to be the big damage punch, a massive amount of general-purpose shooting attacks between blast and mortal wounds. Great for that sustained hit stratagem if you want to use it, maybe most commonly with an Einhir champion, though can use a Carl. Otherwise, the Sagittars tend to be a main vehicle front line. They get scouts and some big nasty guns, either the big lasers or the missile launchers. Having 3 or more in a list is really quite common. Hernkin Pioneers are fast-moving scouts with some volume fire, good for drawing a bead on double judgment marked things early in the game. Again, it's a very rare list that doesn't take a couple of units of them. Hearthkin Warriors are often there, maybe not so much as a desperately standout datasheet, but maybe more out of necessity, often to fill Sagittars, and they do provide sticky objectives as well, which is nice. And maybe out of the rest, the Hekason Land Fortress, despite the big investment, still sees play in most armies. A great big bastion of power that can also act as a transport, handing out some serious firepower, and can be a good use of stratagems as well. I'd rate that most of the other things not mentioned as maybe just a little bit more take or leave, though all absolutely usable. Lots of people like their Brokir Thunderkin or their Chthonian Berserks. For the Necrons, their top lists either tend to be Canoptek Court or Hypercrypt Legion, with perhaps Awakened Dynasty being the next most common after that. Canoptek Court feels like it's the most game warping one, just directly making every Canoptek unit so much better, and other things a lot more mid by comparison. Certainly in Canoptek Court, race leading Technomancers are likely to be taken, often in 3 blocks of 6 of them, and usually backed up by a whole trio of Canoptek Doomstalkers standing in the deployment zone, getting their big rerolls, handing out lots of scary firepower both to vehicles and Elite 3 wound infantry. Otherwise, outside of that, I feel like things are a lot more mixed. The majority of lists tend to take some cheap units for secondaries, tending to be individual Locust Destroyers, which are nice cheap 30-point units, or small squads of Scarabs, which are going to be less relevant after the OC0 change. Both of those seem to crop up in more lists than they don't. The Catan tend to be in more lists than they aren't, maybe a bit more in Hypercrypt versus Canoptek Court, and the Nightbringer, Void Dragon, and Transcendent all see a bit of play. Perhaps no single one of those is truly auto-include though, it's more the combination of the many. And then otherwise for maybe the most big and common formation is Immortals with some sort of character support, though the exact characters can vary. Immortals tend to be the staple though, maybe with Tesla to stack a whole bunch of saves on the midfield objectives. Plasmancers can be kind of fun with them in Canoptek Court, perhaps Chronomancers in Hypercrypt, or Luminor Seraz for some nice AP tricks. Necrons are a kind of interesting one. I feel like the Canoptek Court list with triple Wraith and triple Doomstalkers, plus a few secondary units, absolutely does have a bunch of auto-includes, but other elements to support that, or in other armies, are maybe a little bit more take or leave. Next up, for the forces of the greater good, they've not so long had their codex out. Like the Necrons, the detachments for the tower can skew them in some pretty majorly different directions, the biggest one being the Kroot Hunting Pack, where obviously the Kroot units are great and everything else de-emphasized. Starting with that one, it's pretty much most of the Kroot characters, bigger units of 20 squad carnivores, some rampagers as the focus for stratagems, likely some Farstalkers with Trail Shapers, and then some anti-tank supports to do what the Kroot can't, maybe Hammerheads being the single most common choice there. Outside of Kroot though, for more normal tower lists, Stealth Suits by far win the auto-include contest I think. At 60-point units with Infiltrate, there'd be a good chance that there'd be an auto-include unit, even if they didn't have a particular exciting special rule, but given that they're the single best thing to guide things in the army, it's hard to pass them up. Rerolling ones to hit and wound is kind of immense, particularly when applied to some big scary tower shooting in the backfield. Otherwise, for things beyond that, Riptides do seem to remain a notable staple, even up at 180 points, one of the toughest data sheets, and they can fall back and shoot, both of which working together does mean that they're quite nice in the midfield and skirmishing. The mid-strength Iron Accelerator quite likes Montcar with the lethal hits as well. Otherwise, Devilfish and Breachers are in the vast majority of lists despite the big points increase that they took. They went up a big 30 points for the whole combo with the Fireblade. But it seems that Tower armies don't really have much better to replace them in terms of things to push themselves onto the midboard and deal a bunch of damage. For essentially infantry with small arms, their shooting can still be kind of apocalyptic. Otherwise, Pathfinders are used in good numbers. Piranhas at 55 points are pretty excellent scouting skirmishers with a bunch of Seeker missiles for an alpha strike. Hammerheads do good anti-tank, far more so than broadsides after their points nerf, and ghost kills are pretty threatening for a big scary lone operative with a big gun that you can't shoot back. Unfortunately, crisis suits certainly aren't looking like they're in this auto-include sort of area. Looks like the overall offering isn't quite reliably good enough to see play everywhere, which is a bit of a shame given how central they are to the way that the army is built and how a lot of enhancements and fun stuff seems to work around them with commanders. Finally, last but not least, we have the greenskins with the Orks. Again, big variations depending on detachment, though a few things tend to crop up in the majority of them. The scoring units tend to be the most all over the place. Gretchen for 40 points are a steal when they farm command points on objectives, and even beyond that are just a genuinely irritating objective grabbing nuisance unit. 11 bodies with OC2 at 40 points is no bad thing at all, even if they don't have really any big threat. Almost every list takes a couple of units of Storm Boys for very nice secondary objective takers. They can deep strike for a cheapish unit, move really quite fast, and still threaten to beat up some light infantry when they get there. They get the job done fast. Meganobs might get next level and bully boys, though are certainly worth considering in just about every detachment given the strength of the datasheet. Massive great big tough orcs with a 4+ feel no pain when they go into the war. Big threat with their kill saws, and are pretty nice with the Warboss and Mega Armor or Ghazghkull to lead them, and then a truck to get them there, which in itself I think is in borderline auto-include territory for just how useful it is to how many armies. 65 points for a cheap transport to zoom some Orky violence into place and then can threaten to tank shock things really hard with a Wrecking Ball. Otherwise, perhaps standout, regardless of detachment, is the standard Warboss. 65 points is just immense for his stats. He gets his massive damage boost in the war, and also just the +1 to hit is very nice when he's leading boys or knobs. Nice to have him jumping out of a truck or a battle wagon and into melee. Finally, for a few more detachment-specific things, the standard Knob Squad seems to be the next one to fall back on in Bully Boys, likely after maxing out 3 units of Mega Knobs, though boys with War Bosses work very well as well. Certainly the standard boys are pretty amazing in most detachments with their sticky objectives. They get kind of godly in Green Tide. 5+ invulnerable saves all day long is great, and they can skirmish for the mid-board objectives with tons of OC. As well as War Bosses, Weird Boys and Pain Boys tend to be fairly auto-include here. Weird Boys to teleport them round the board, one of them bearing that reroll to charge enhancement, and Pain Boys for Feel No Pain to make just a couple of mobs ridiculously tanky. The other detachments all add their quirks a bit more, very different picks in Dread Mob for example if you want to run that. Likely you'll be seeing lots of Killer Cans, Looters, and probably some of the bigger Titanic Walkers there. In any case though, that just about brings us to the end of a look through every single faction in Warhammer 40k, and some of the units that are most commonly run as auto-includes in tournament lists at the moment, the majority of people choosing to pick them up. Look forward to hearing any of your thoughts on the video down in the comments below. Would you have ranked any other units in the borderline auto-include sort of territory as we've been talking through here, or really question whether a few of these established staples are worth it? Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. A big thank you to the video sponsor, the Wargamer, as well. If you're in the UK, feel free to give their web store a look. I'll link it down in the video description as mentioned earlier. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.